Hello, Patrick. Welcome
Hi, Patrick.
to Discovering Dowsing. It's great to have you on the show. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you both, Alex and David, for the invitation and the opportunity to put our minds together and share the inspirations unfolding.
Absolutely. And would it be possible, Patrick, for you to describe a little bit about who you are, how you are, how you roll, and your connection, I guess, with dowsing, as well as that broader topic we're going to explore today about the elemental kingdom and our connection with that?
Yes, thank you. So my circumstance, I was born and raised in a school of spiritual healing and dowsing in rural Scotland in Fife that my parents had set up in 1959. And their practice was based on direct communication with spirit guides, with the angelic, as well as the elemental and nature spirit communities, with a focus on healing and bringing health and balance into systems where there was discord and disease. And their practice was primarily focused on people, but also they worked a lot with animals and they worked a certain amount with places, which was the part of the work that got my interest most keenly focused.
Mm.
So, trained at the kitchen table first with them, and dowsing was very much central to their daily life. There was a pendulum next to the Aga, there was a pendulum next to the telephone, whether the bread was ready to come out of the oven or which was the best route to take on a long journey were all automatically considered with dowsing. Um, Dad was on trustee board of BSD. He was vice president for a while. So he was very much part of that community for many years, both helping to share and teach as well as guide the society. So without much initiative, really, I sort of just followed on and joined the family practice because we were mostly in the practice doing human health. I went and took a degree in medicine just so that I was better informed about all of uh, the different aspects of health and contemporary health care, and did a couple of years of junior doctoring in National Health Service before moving more definitively into the work that I do now, which is the subtle energy work with landscape. And I got into it first very much from a healing aspect. The dowsing community is well familiar with geopathic stress,
Mm.
where at one point World Health Organization declared that 30% of our buildings were sick buildings based on a criteria of 20% or more of the occupants having health or comfort problems arising from the site. So
Mm.
that aspect of environmental health didn't seem on radar for um, the conventionally home yeah, hospital and particularly the hospital-based medicine wasn't really looking at environmental impact outside of air or water qualities.
Mm.
So that took me into the work, just jobbing around, working with sad or grumpy dragons, and then all the things that go with that, the ghosts, the curses, the residual energies, the uh, non-contemporary boundaries or identity that a place is carrying, and that gradually spread from domestic through commercial into the agricultural work that um, has allowed me to really develop and understand those processes in the growing system, both plants and animals, as well as navigating and negotiating with wildlife as to how the system can support everybody in it.
That
Yeah,
that sounds like a really magical upbringing to have had, and just to be kind of immersed and surrounded in that the yeah, working with energies straight from a young age must have had such a massive and positive impact to you. For me, I didn't kind of come to it until mid 20s. So yeah, I'm just kind of blown away by yeah, just being fully immersed in it at such a young age.
it makes it very normal and very natural, and it makes it very integrated.
Yeah.
Uh, uh, in truth, the difficulty then is navigating the world of people who don't think that way. Uh, but it's yes, it makes the integration of experience much easier if you've got a pre-existing conceptual framework, and also just seeing how competent adults use it in their lives
Right.
um, in very practical and simple and useful ways. Yeah, so that was great.
Yeah.
Also, at a time, Patrick, when it was relatively unknown, quite early days. There was, I guess, Findhorn was happening in a similar time frame. Was there any connection between your parents and the Findhorn community?
A little bit. Mum and Dad were really on a healing track, rather than a community track.
Mm.
Um, Findhorn, they got going in the 60s, and there was a certain amount of connections and coming and going between Peter and Eileen Caddy and Mum and Dad back in the day, but um, there wasn't really much connection. Findhorn's another 2.5, 3 hours on up further into Scotland, and they were mostly on their sort of development community focus rather than a healing one per se. So,
Mm.
but it was at a time, as you say, when there wasn't much going on. Specifically, the witchcraft laws in this country, in the UK, they don't get repealed until the early 1950s. And
Wow.
so, uh, although there was a lot of spiritualism and dowsing practices going on, they were very covert because they were deemed antisocial and demonic and uh, generally of dark arts. So
Mm.
there was a lot of disapproval around those practices. So they kind of were underground, and often dowsers wouldn't reveal their work until after they'd retired because of potential compromise to their professional identity outside of the dowsing world. And we see with the British Society of Dowsers, that's really why it starts with military officers setting it up and staffing it for so many years, because the military were very open to the use and practice. They weren't concerned um, about anything other than whether it worked. So yeah, Dad's mate, my uh, mentor, Major General Bill Cooper, he was president of British Society of Dowsers, who got me onto the trustee board um, in 1995. But he'd been trained to douse by the military in Royal Engineering College and had used that everywhere, including finding live landmines in the Korean conflict. But he had a military cross, and he was the fourth most senior military officer in British Army at retirement, Quartermaster General. So dowsing was ordinary and central in his life. And Colonel Bell sets it up, and you can look through the generals and major generals and colonels and so who've been on the trustee board. So it was very present in the military. Was where my dad got into it. He discovered his gift of healing age 19, fighting a rearguard action at Dunkirk, and then stayed in the military for 20 years and going across North Africa with Montgomery, they would literally have a seance every single night. Was their
Wow.
surveillance because they didn't have satellites or air cover for scouting ahead. So they were really leaning in on uh, intuition, instinct, dowsing, direct mediumship uh, relationship just for doing their thing. So, but it wasn't in the public mind,
No.
and was very much. I was once in Cameroon, in West Africa, during a 4 month medical stint there, and they needed a new well for the community, and it had to be dowsed. But the only person allowed to hold the dowsing rods was the Catholic priest, because anybody else would obviously have had demons jump into their head through the dowsing rods. So I think, particularly in the UK, it's been around forever, but it's been held within either power groups or just specialist organizations doing their own thing quietly.
Mm. That's fascinating. And David, you've got a background in the military sort of realm as well, haven't you? Did you come
Yeah,
across dowsing in that regard when you were connected in that way?
no, not at all. Um, yeah, it wasn't something that kind of came up in any way, shape, or form. I was in the Royal Electrical Mechanical Engineers, and yeah, it just wasn't something that was in that field. So I can imagine that the engineers, it was something quite standard, especially probably more so for the water side of things. Um, yeah, I've not heard of it being used for landmines, but I do know quite a few ex-military who do douse. Um, one one particular guy was ex-special forces, and he was a dowser, and yeah, he went off and did all sorts of stuff that he could never talk about, and yeah, he ended up being an artisan builder in France when he retired, and he would douse a building, douse a plot to see where things should be built, and you know that was quite normal for him. So yeah, it's funny the kind of crossover, isn't it? You wouldn't
Mhm.
kind of perceive that the military would be open to that, but yeah, it makes complete sense, and uh, it makes sense that people who are trained in that way need to be intuitive, and actually to be intuitive would be an advantage. Yeah.
Mm. And trusting in
It's
the
part
outcome.
of life.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's so many depths here. And like you were saying, David, with that friend of yours, the ex-army chappie, just building and dowsing. Patrick, you mentioned earlier about grumpy dragons. And, sometimes people, well, I guess it probably happens a lot, doesn't it? When people throw up a building or do a copy paste building development from plan, and there's not that much consciousness going in, it's more automatic. Unlike the stories that you hear in places like Iceland, where they're still very connected with the concept of you get permission first. You know, there's we're talking, overall about elementals today. How would you describe, Patrick, what an elemental being or the community of elemental beings is?
Yeah, great question, Alex. That's really to the heart of the matter, isn't it? Um, simple conceptual framework that I've come to use as my standard. Um, at some level, everything is vibrating and is vibrational. And left to itself, a wave keeps on going through the ocean till it hits the beach or through the uh, atmosphere till it fizzles out somewhere. So for a thing to be present in time and space and have physicality, that waveform needs to become recursive and a standing wave. And we can think of water coming down a river and meeting a rock and creating a circular standing wave behind it. So that although there's dynamic motion, there's also a stable thing that we can say there's the wave and identify it as its own thing. So so for physical matter to exist, there has to be a pre-existing stable electromagnetic toroidal field, which is the bagel shape that we're familiar with. And so the lines of flux, the lines of chi or electromagnetism that are that field, that hold that field, are our dragons. So dragons come first because they are the field matrix, as it were. And then in that stable space, we can have physical matter accumulate and take shape and form. And that would be the elemental realm. So it's the vibrational, it's the vibrational essence and substance of earth and water and air and fire, the sort of Lego blocks, as it were, that are perceived, created environment is constructed from and animated by. And then in that landscape of elemental structure and form, then the rest of us get to play: the nature spirits, the plants, the animals, the birds, the bees, the people, and everybody else who has an association with life in physical form as well as purely vibrational. So within that model, then the elementals are the vibrational consciousness, organizing, directive intelligences that are literally holding the physical realm. So the spirit of water, the spirit of the soil, the spirit of the weather, the spirit of the fire, and what we've always known and what we're remembering is that rather than physical material form being inanimate, it is very much centrally inhabited and guided by interactive intelligence. And I think many of the listeners will be familiar with Dr. Emoto's beautiful pictures of how our thoughts imprint into water as one of the elemental consciousnesses. And then Veda Austin more recently has shown us even more how water will imprint and take on our thoughts and feelings. But beyond that, once we really get down to it, we find that we can change the volume and constituency of water in wells. Early in my career, in I think 1997, we had a drought, couple of drought years here in Vermont, and most people in Vermont are on personal water supplies. So shallow springs were going dry, and the dowsers were out dowsing for deeper ones, and the drillers were out drilling behind them. And I had an occasion, a dear friend of mine lives in a little house in the woods and got all her water for 20 years from a 3-foot shallow spring in the woods above our house. And this went dry. And so Jen and our friend Sue and I all went up to say hello to the spirit of this spring. And there it was. It was a 3 foot dry, shallow hole in the woods. Um, but there was a clear sense, and through dowsing and extending our heart mind into the vibration intelligence of the space, we were able to connect with what we termed the spirit of the spring, the water intelligence there. And we introduced ourselves and explained what we were up to and asked if it was able to help us. And it said, yes, this is a dowsing process. And then, are you willing to help us? And it said, yes. And we asked, well, is there anything you need from us? And it said, can you sing to me, please? And so we checked left, we checked right. There was nobody else in the woods. We had a good old sing, made a joyful noise. And then within 48 hours, with no rain event, either locally or in the catchment region, the spring was overflowing within 48 hours again. The water just came back up out of the ground. And then I had an almost identical experience a week later on another site, shallow spring, almost gone dry. That one not quite dry, but down to a tiny trickle. And
Mm.
uh, we loved it up and asked if it could and would, and it wanted to be sung to as well. So had a good sing, and 48 hours later, that one was gushing and overflowing again. And then the following week, I was working with dragons and ghosts on a property, and we were having a cup of tea after the consult, and the client said, I think I can tell you this, but I haven't mentioned it to anybody else. My spring went dry, and I sang to it, and it came back to life. And as you can imagine, I've now got many stories like that.
Yeah.
But it leaves me in no doubt that there's a guiding creative intelligence holding, expressing, guiding water as a physical entity, and by connecting to that, then we can create truly a cooperative, co-creative process and practice with the beings that are our landscape. And whether that's working with water in your well or in your house or in the watering can or in the trough for the animals, water's always an easy one to work with. Weather, there's a lot we can do with weather. When I was around British Society of Dowsers, if you were hosting a weekend, you were responsible for booking the weather. And if the weather was not satisfactory, you'd due everybody around in the pub afterwards, so the stakes were high. Um,
So, Patrick, would
yeah,
I be correct in saying that your perception of these elements is purely through dowsing, or is there other ways that you perceive it as well?
yes. Such a great question, David. I think there's a spectrum of divinatory practices, just to use a sort of general categorization. And at one end of that spectrum, so any divinatory practice just means connecting with the unseen intelligence in the vibrational realm of whatever nature that is, angelic, human, nature, spirit, or other. So at one end of the spectrum, we've got out of body techniques, either full trance mediumship, where we simply step out of body while a circle of friends holds it for us, and an inhabiting, overshadowing spirit steps in and speaks through us. Up in those sort of out of body experiences, we might also include astral projection, full on shamanic journeys, remote viewing perhaps, but techniques where you're taking yourself out of your physical body for a focused and temporary time. And then down the spectrum, we come into direct connection practices where we don't leave our body. So we're going into a light meditative space, and we're allowing alpha and theta, which is the intuitive and the envisioned parts of our brain to relate and respond and form pictures and images inside of ourselves in response to communications received, what we might call telepathy. So that's a very useful space to work in when you've got open questions, particularly. And then down from that, we start using tools. First, we use tools of intermediary pattern that the communication comes through, whether those are tarot cards or runes or the I Ching or other forms of imprint scrying in water or fire or clouds, etc. And then finally, at the bottom end of the scale, or the other extreme end of the scale, are the binary practices, where we stay fully in embodied logical mind, and use that as obviously the medium of exchange of communication. The dowsing practices, because they're binary and embodied, they're very safe techniques generally to use. That's one of their great advantages. Because you have a physical tool in your hand, it keeps part of your mind in your body, stops you drifting off like a helium balloon into the cosmos somewhere. But it also obviously gives us the opportunity to get specific and concrete answers to specific and concrete questions. However, a lot of the interaction really that we're having is more conversational, truly. And if I want to get your opinion or advice about something, it's going to take me an awfully long time to work through asking you yes or no questions, rather than just sitting down, having a cup of tea, and opening my mind to hear whatever you've got to say about the matter. So, in practice, both for myself and teaching students, I avoid teaching or using out of body techniques because that requires much more training and discipline and a high level of support. So I mostly work in the open-minded, intuitive, telepathic space and just sort of switch that on or off or change the volume on that as required, and then integrate that with dowsing to get clear, decisive answers on specific, actual what to do things, or who needs what kind of help. So that's what I find works best for me. But I think it's useful to have different tools in the toolkit, not just a hammer, but a screwdriver and a chisel and a paintbrush as well.
One thing I love, Patrick, is how you've talked about singing and music. And David and I had a recent episode where we talked about sound and dowsing and sacred spaces, sacred sites, and how in Avebury in particular it feels a bit like almost like a giant singing bowl, doesn't it? The sort of the feeling you get there is one of being held and the sound being contained. One experience I had at a house I was visiting, just very it was sort of helping with the feng shui of the house, helping sort of balance and clear and harmonize. And I got a sense of the little collection of gnomes underneath the floor in the study. And they, like you were saying about that telepathic sort of connection, the way I perceive sometimes, especially the gnomic kingdom, and especially since I've developed more of a connection with the dragon energies, it seems to be easier to have these dialogues. I feel their energy embodied through me. And so sometimes I feel if I'm connecting with that gnomic kingdom and the little gaggle there, I felt a bit pressed and sort of almost like there's weight on me. Or sometimes they're sort of pushed upon that way and they sort of seem to have like pushing them backwards, almost off kilter. And that one visit I'm remembering, they asked for a song to help heal them.
Ooh.
And in particular, that sort of folk music that's quite jaunty and like Morris dancing kind of feel to it. It just seems to fit, and so stomping around as well. It's sort of it's just to bring the joy back, and that kind of seems to harmonize. So I'm loving that you've been singing to springs and just being told that and hearing that and sharing that with us, because that's very much been an experience. And there's something about the resonance and the frequency sound and the continuum to light, and how, in a sacred space. I was in the Hurler Stone Circle recently for a goddess day, and we sung and danced in the main circle, and we had the cows coming, the horses, and there was a veritable audience of nature around. And so there's something in it, and the dowsing helps us refine down to that certain point, like you were saying, the binary. After you get the intuitive sort of dialogue, it helps refine it a bit somehow. So yeah, I love that. Thank you.
Sound of the human voice in the landscape is part of what animates all things, I think. Now our culture has gone self-conscious and shy of its singing, but the landscape loves to hear the human voice, just as we love to hear bird song. Um, yeah, Alex, I would just make one comment in terms of the connection with the nature spirits, as you're describing a very embodied
Mm.
experience of them coming right into your personal space. Um, Generally, in practice, with all connections, I prefer to keep them. Um, I'm the person and you're the gnome. And so we stand close to each other and talk to each other, but I don't necessarily let them into my energy field. Um, that is a good way to do it, and it's an easy way to do it. And I do sometimes do that. I would call that a merging, a full or partial merge. And then, as you describe, you feel your feelings and their feelings become unified, and you can feel gnomeness, and mind becomes gnome mind. If we do that merge, we need to make sure that everybody, you know, separates out again once the business is done.
Yes.
Uh, every now and again, uh, you can get caught out and kind of bring one home with you, kind of same as a ghost. And so, particularly if there's displaced or traumatized elementals on a site, as you were describing, because the houses have been built in pre-existing habitat.
Mm.
They may be looking for somewhere else to be, and you might look like a really nice and kind person, so they'll just come home with you.
So what would be the problem with them then coming home with you and setting up camp in your house? What would
No problem if they're in the garden. Uh, Often the nature spirits, they don't really like to be constrained in the house, so they can get restless. They can get into the wherever energy's flowing, so the electrical system, the plumbing system, the um, so different from a sort of helpful house elf. You kind of end up with a squirrel in your kitchen, and it doesn't actually really want to be there. It wants to be with its brothers and sisters and cousins and aunts out in the woods, or at least in the garden. So yeah, just the same as when anything you displacement, disorientation patterns can arise if
Mm.
things aren't comfortable where they are.
okay?
Yeah, so energetic hygiene and protection is really helpful to sort of pre and post any interaction. And yeah, I must admit, actually, Patrick, it's very rare for me to have that embodied experience, and so far it's typically just been a handful of times with, in particular, for some reason, the gnomic kingdom. And it's been a merry dance, and there've been some lovely messages. And yes, it's so vital to sort of have that clarity afterwards and not have a little gnome family sort of coming along.
Sounds like you've got gnome in your lineage somewhere. I'm pretty sure I've got elf in mine. Uh, that's where I do my merging, is in the forest mostly.
Mm,
Uh, yeah, no, it's a good practice to do. I think it just needs to be a very conscious practice. The
yes.
other thing with working, just as an observation with the elementals, nature spirits also, uh, their sense of individual versus collective is quite different from ours. And also there's a level of vibrational. I don't like to call it hierarchy because I think the hierarchy is a radius through a circle of consciousness. But
Mm,
the point is there. Uh, at one level, elemental is sort of primarily an etheric vibrational consciousness that's informed by higher levels of astral consciousness, and it has some of that going on side of it, but it also then is informed by superimposed patterns. And so we sort of talk about the overlighting diva of a place, or in Shakespearean language, we talk about king and queen of fairies. So in terms of who do we look to talk to, is it a chat with the gnomes in the garden because that's the business, or are we talking to some overlighting representative of elemental and nature spirit for a whole farm, which might be hundreds or thousands of acres, or of a watershed, of a valley, of a bioregion? So, just the same as navigating in the human world, you need an electrician or a plumber or a mechanic, and you need the local guy, or do you need to speak to somebody in head office?
I
Um,
love that.
it all just depends on, the nature of the concern. As you describe, you show up in a place and there's an issue to deal with, and you kind of navigate by intuition and guidance and first principles. But that's helpful, I find, just in navigating that unseen. Is this elemental business, nature spirit business, water business, weather business, and at what level of interaction? Am I really just speaking to the locals? Um, my garden diva is called Mitzi, and she's got another name that I was once allowed to know, but only on the promise that I forgot it, which I did. But it sounded like starlight and moonlight and silver. Anyway, she's Mitzi, and she just tells me about anything going on in the garden that I need to know about and directs my attention accordingly. So she's sort of a representative, um, uh, like that one point, and then she can bring me to look more deeply at the soil in a particular bed, or one of the plants is getting hammered by lily beetles, or it's time for biodynamic preps, or whatever it is. So that's quite a useful concept in navigating elemental nature spirit, is uh, what aspect of nature am I communicating with, and at what level of um, I don't want to use the words hierarchy or authority, but management capacity, we might
Yes.
say.
Yeah, that's fascinating because, I've heard people talk about an elemental spirit for an individual blade of grass. So we're talking at the micro as well as the macro that you've just described, and zooming in and out on that radius, if you like, or the radial spectrum in that circle of the whole is a really valuable insight. And I wonder if people who may not have had a conscious connection with the elemental realms, I wonder if perhaps a doorway into that is the well known and somewhat comfortable notion of talking to plants. So you've just talked about Mitzi and the communication you have. It's a similar pattern, right? You're just sort of, almost like a stream of consciousness. If somebody's used to sort of tending to their plants and talking to them while they're tending, they might get a bit of feedback or a sense of yes or no, or maybe, while they're having that quiet moment that's quite serene.
Absolutely. No, I think we should be talking to everything all the time, at least while we're engaging with it. Plants are an easier place to start because you can see it, and their consciousness is maybe a little more similar to ours. They have physicality, obviously. They have needs of water and air and nutrients, same as us. So we're definitely talking to a comparable, obviously intelligent life form. So it's easier to get your head into, I think. And then, just as you say, the green fingered ones amongst us are the ones who I think merge or just are in that alpha theta instinctive intuitive when they're tending to them, and they simply know when they need water or when they need light or when they need propagating or when they need pruning or when they need some kind of soil amendment. And how a gardener languages that may just be, very simple in terms of care of the plant and the garden. But I think it's clear that some people just are gifted naturally in that way and intuitive, inevitable plant whisperers, and those are the ones we want,
Mm.
growing our food and tending our growing spaces.
Yes, in that conscious and hopefully biodynamic way as well, in harmony with the waxing and waning of the moon, and how the seasons are naturally rolling. And I wonder if we could once perceive these beings in front of us. And I wonder if that's potentially going to be our experience again.
I think I think we've we tried to do things too quickly. I think that's for me, when I prune a tree or a shrub or something, I have to take my time with it. And I will quite often be, taking my time with it and then have to stand back. And it's in the standing back, it's like you take that moment to connect, and your logical mind says that you're looking back for the shape, but are you just looking back to listen and or standing back to listen and know where to work next? And it I, I think one of the things that you get kind of last month and around this month is a wassail where they used to sing to the orchard to give thanks for the fruit, but also to scare away the spirits, and also bring in the good spirits to then bear the good fruit for the next harvest. And I think that very much says something about what we've lost. We've lost that taking the time to sing to the plants, to give thanks to the plants, to welcome back the good spirits, to ward off the evil spirits. And yeah, maybe that's what we need to just take more time and to be more thankful.
Yes, and the listening, as you describe, is really what we need the time for,
Mm.
to make sure we're actually in dialogue. Because it is, for want of a better word, a telepathic communication where we're using the vibrations of our thoughts to communicate our intentions and ask our requests, and then we need to listen to that answer and how it comes. varying degrees, because it's a vibrational imprint coming back to us that we then need to interpret, and the way we interpret is to make it an inner vision or an inner knowing or an inspiration or an idea or a thought or almost like a listened or auditory conversation. But it's on us to do that listening, and then continue the conversation as long as it needs to. I'm sure you find in practice also the actual communication is more or less instant. The time is the time required to be in the space for the communication to occur. So it's,
Yeah.
yeah, stand back for long enough until you really can feel the tree heart to heart, and you've got some agenda about it being orchard worthy for how you need to manage it, and then it's probably got a pretty good idea about what it needs to be the tree that it is. Um, and so, yeah, it's that. I couldn't agree more. The patience is in the slowing down long enough for almost instant communication then to occur.
I've noticed that time's been a bit interesting lately. It feels like everything's speeding up. And yet at the same time, like we've just been discussing, I feel that the most important thing is to slow down and to be still right now. And there's so many blessings in that. So yeah, it's quite an interesting time, sort of stretching and compressing and no time as well. It's fascinating. We're
I'm surprisingly fluid, isn't it? Uh,
very
I'd also just say, uh, commenting, Alex, your thought of will we come to a point where we can see them with an outer vision again? Um, uh, they don't have physical bodies, obviously. So the vibrational frequency is, that we're perceiving. It's we can see each other because sunlight's bouncing off of us, and so our vision is set for the window of frequencies that sunlight is, but we can't see X-rays or microwaves or radio waves or even the waves of our thought, which are the same as sunlight, just in a slightly different frequency.
mm,
So I think when we see non-physical beings, it's where our mind is creating the imprint that they are. They can intensify themselves, I think. So the vibration is very strong and very clearly perceptive. Um, uh, and so, but it's typically more of an inner vision,
mm,
I think, than an outer vision. Also, just to say, uh, often when we wake up to these things, our perceptual capacity goes uh, in front of our capacity to manage that. And people can get, particularly if you sort of do a sudden dramatic initiation like a psychedelic journey or an ayahuasca trip, the filters can get dropped in a way that we then aren't competent to put them back up or manage the settings. Sometimes it's nice to have the window open. Sometimes I want a fly screen. Sometimes I want the window shut. Sometimes I want a curtain over it, so I can vary the degree of, uh, you know, energy, air, water, sunlight, etc., coming through. So, um, uh, I think you can ask to and allow yourself to see them, um, and explore that, and then sort of switch it off when you have to go back to the supermarket or pick the kids up from school. Um, because if we're in a permanently unfiltered state, it can be very overwhelming and distracting to us, and very difficult then on our mental health.
mm.
Um, depending on personality and character. So I think we can see them, but we need to let ourselves see them, and it's a sort of inner vision that's very real. It's not a made up fantasy making with your mind. It's allowing your mind to make that image um, in response to perceiving their vibrational
Mm.
um, signature.
Yes, yes, because sometimes it could be in the form of a color or in a symbol or a certain type of shape. And it's, I guess, the symbol, like you mentioned earlier about the tarot, it just speaks to the soul. It's a language of the heart and the soul. So if you get something visually represented, it can just do that simple bypassing the conscious mind and going straight in. So that's my perception of how we can perceive these beings in
Mm.
certain ways. So, Patrick, you've been in this realm, in this world, and expanding your consciousness and helping others to learn in a similar way. Are you teaching? Have you got a program as such at the moment that you because you travel sometimes, don't you, with your work and do workshops?
Yes, at the moment, I do uh, sometimes 3 day, sometimes 4 day workshops, a foundation or level one introduction to uh, all such matters, and then a 3 or 4 day level two. And those are now running in southwest of England, being hosted by an organization called the Animate Earth Collective. And so we've got a level one, level two coming up in October. Um, Previously did one in January, just passed in October previously. So those are available for anyone in the UK.
Mhm.
And then I run that program here in Vermont, um, May and September times, and in Australia during March and April. So you can
Wow, truly international there,
come and
Patrick.
take classes in either New South Wales or Tasmania uh,
Wow.
in the next couple of months. Um, so those are on site in person. Um, I do have various videos, podcasts like this one, with information. There's an 11 series teleclass that we recorded during COVID. That's a full workshop content series. That's a for purchase at the princely sum of $10 per class, I think. And then I'm also available for one-on-one coaching for people who find that that's helpful, and we can generally do that over a Zoom call, um, or several, depending on whether somebody's got an issue they want help with, or sort of more mentoring, coaching,
Mm.
development.
Thank
Mm.
you, Patrick. That's wonderful. And we'll make sure we put a link to your website and to Animate Earth or any other of those workshops that you're doing in person in the podcast show notes. If you were just to sort of start wrapping up, if you were to offer any suggestions for somebody just starting out on this journey to learn more about the elemental realms and how to interact or how to help support, if they feel like there's something a little bit imbalanced where they are, what would you recommend they start with or start on their journey?
Yes, I think all of this. It's easiest to do in the presence of real need. And so, what is either in our immediate environment that's ours to manage,
Mm.
the garden, the spirit of the car, spirit of the lawnmower, um, things need our attention. And so, just like David pruning the tree, if we stop and pause and get into zone before taking necessary physical action, whatever that is, and just tune into the spirit of the thing that we're working with first, and then allow that to be our helper and guider as to how to go about the job. Um, so I think when there's need, then it's easy to get a connection. And my simple process is just start by stopping, centering, getting into a loving heart space, so that I'm available and clear. And then whatever I then hold in mind as an idea or a concept, I automatically create a rapport with that, whether it's the spirit of the spring or the spirit of the snowblower I'm going to go and work with later on today, um, or any task. If we just get into heart space, loving rapport by holding the thing in mind until we feel a sense of connection and rapport with that, and then just do a mind share as to what you're up to, what you need, any thoughts or ideas, and either it'll say that's a good idea, or actually, if you do this first, you'll get on twice as quick, or um, you know, that's a good idea, but wait until after the full moon, whatever it might be. So, jobs around house, obviously, people like yourself, Alex, when we're being called to work with other people, then there's a need for us to engage and connect with whatever is needing help. So I'd go with need, and uh, just take the time to drop into space. Having dropped into space, I do like generally, especially if I'm off site, to make sure first I've got my companion angels close in and helping me, so that then, as we discussed, when I do make connection with elementals or nature spirits, I've got somebody to observe and buffer, that I don't go and um, leave part of myself there when I'm done, or take part of that home when I'm done.
Mm.
And then once the communication's closed, we just give thanks and love and hang up the phone, really.
Love
Easy
that.
as that.
Beautiful. That is so simple and heart-based as well and connected. It's like an inner yet also outer dialogue.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Mm. Thank you, Patrick. That's been really interesting to listen to you. Yeah, amazing.
Absolute pleasure to connect you guys. Thanks so much for inviting me into this space. And yes, give my love to your garden gnomes.